In the heart of a world trembling on the brink, where headlines scream of political tension and the drums of war beat a low, steady rhythm, there lies a story older than the nations themselves. It is not a story found in the frantic scroll of a news feed, but one etched in ancient scrolls, whispered in the dust of forgotten kingdoms, and written in the very stars that watched over the dawn of man. This is the story of a nation once called Persia, a name that echoes with the splendor of empires and the weight of prophecy. Today, we know it as Iran, a land of stark beauty and fierce ambition, standing at the epicenter of global conflict. But what if its modern defiance, its challenge to the West, and its ominous threats against Israel were not merely political maneuvers, but the movements of a figure in a divine play, a final act written millennia ago? To understand the darkness of the prophecy, we must first remember the light. Long before Iran became a specter in Western eyes, the Persian Empire was a beacon of hope in the ancient world. Its history is forever entwined with the story of Israel, not as an enemy, but as a deliverer. Imagine the despair of the Jewish people, exiled in Babylon, their temple in ruins, their homeland a distant memory. For 70 years they wept by the rivers of a foreign land, their hope dwindling to a flicker. Then, a king arose unlike any other, Cyrus the Great. The book of Isaiah, written over a century before Cyrus was even born, names him specifically. In Isaiah 45, God calls him his anointed, a gentile king chosen for a divine purpose. It was Cyrus who conquered the mighty Babylonian Empire, and in an act of unprecedented grace, issued a decree that shattered the chains of exile. He did not just allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem, he funded the rebuilding of their sacred temple, returning the treasures Babylon had stolen. It was a golden age, a testament to a time when Persia was an instrument of God's redemptive plan, a friend to his chosen people. The songs of homecoming, the joyous labor of rebuilding the house of the Lord were made possible by the shadow of Persia's benevolent wing. But history's pages turn, and the ink that writes of glory can also write of doom. Within the same sacred texts that celebrate Cyrus, a chilling premonition takes root. The prophet Ezekiel, standing amidst the exiles even before their liberation, was given a vision of a distant, terrifying future. In the 38th chapter of his book, God reveals a time known as the latter days, when Israel, restored and living in apparent peace, would face an invasion of unimaginable scale. A great coalition of nations from the north would gather, drawn together by an unseen force with one malevolent goal, the complete annihilation of the Jewish state. And there, listed among the sworn enemies in this final war, is a name that sends a shiver through the annals of time: Persia. The friend would become the foe, the deliverer would join the destroyers. The prophecy was set, a dark seed planted, waiting for the right season to bloom. Fast forward through the centuries, past the rise and fall of empires, to our present hyper-connected world. In a sterile, windowless room, deep within a clandestine intelligence agency known as Aegis Command, a young analyst named Elias Vance stared at 3 glowing monitors. His screen was a dizzying mosaic of satellite imagery, encrypted communications intercepts, and geopolitical heat maps. Elias was a prodigy, a man who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. While his superiors, like the pragmatic and world-weary director Kalin, saw Iran's actions through the familiar lens of regional power struggles and oil politics, Elias sensed something deeper. He felt the pull of an ancient unseen current beneath the surface of modern events. He watched as Iran, the Persia of old, methodically extended its influence. Its proxy armies created a crescent of control across the Middle East. Its scientists worked tirelessly in fortified underground bunkers, inching closer to a weapon that could hold the world hostage. More unsettling were the new alliances. For weeks, Elias had been tracking a series of high-level clandestine meetings. A new axis was forming, not on a public stage but in secret pacts made in the shadows. Leaders from Iran, Rusheth Great Bear of the North and Turkey, the heir to the Ottoman Empire, were forging a military and economic partnership that defied traditional Western analysis. Director Kalin had dismissed it. "It's an alliance of convenience, Vance," he'd said, his voice gravelly. "They're united only by their opposition to us. It won't last." But Elias wasn't so sure. He pulled up Ezekiel's prophecy on a 4th, private screen. He read the list of nations again: Magog, often interpreted as Russia; Togama, widely believed to be Turkey; and Persia, modern-day Iran. The names on the ancient scroll mirrored the faces in the encrypted satellite photos. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a perfect match. One rain-lashed night, while the rest of the facility was quiet, Elias ran a new decryption algorithm on a heavily coded data packet, intercepted from a joint Russian-Iranian military channel. For hours, the computer churned, its fans a low hum against the sound of the storm outside. Then, a single file unlocked. It wasn't a dossier or a strategic plan. It was a code name for a future joint operation, a name so chillingly specific it made the blood run cold in Elias's veins. He stared at the translated words on the screen, his breath catching in his throat. Operation Hook in the jaw. With trembling hands, he turned to the ancient text of Ezekiel 38 verse 4, where God speaks to the leader of the invading northern horde. "I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army." The words on the screen and the words on the scroll merged into one terrifying reality. This wasn't politics. This wasn't a game of nations. An ancient divine script was being followed to the letter, and the curtain was about to rise on the final prophesied war. The storm outside raged, but a different kind of tempest was brewing in the silent, sterile confines of Aegis Command. The words "Operation Hook in the Jaw" burned on Elias Vance's screen, a digital brand marking the convergence of ancient text and modern terror. He felt a profound, chilling certainty settle over him, the kind that comes when 1,000 disparate puzzle pieces snap into place to reveal a single terrifying image. He couldn't keep this to himself. This wasn't a theory anymore. It was an active threat profile, hidden in plain sight. With the decrypted file secured on a drive, he walked through the hushed corridors toward the one office that mattered, Director Kalen's. Kalen was a man carved from granite and skepticism. He sat behind a vast, polished mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the chrome and glass of the rest of the facility. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable as Elias laid out his case. Elias didn't just present the data, he told the story. He connected the dots from the joint Russian-Iranian naval drills in the Caspian Sea to the sudden, coordinated cyber attacks on Israeli infrastructure to the final damning codename. "Look at the motive, Director," Elias urged, his voice filled with a desperate intensity. He projected a map onto Kalen's wall, highlighting Israel's newly discovered Leviathan and Tamar natural gas fields in the Mediterranean. Ezekiel 38 says the invading horde comes to capture plunder and to seize spoil. For centuries, scholars wondered what spoil Israel could possibly have. It was a barren land. But now, they are on the verge of becoming an energy superpower, poised to supply Europe and break the Russian stranglehold on gas. This isn't just about ideology anymore. It's about crippling a rival and seizing immense wealth. The prophecy provides the motive that our own economic analysts have been flagging for months. Kalen leaned back, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "Vance, your work is brilliant. Your pattern recognition is second to none. But you're asking me to accept that a 2600-year-old religious text is a valid intelligence document. You're connecting a Russian need for economic leverage with a prophecy about divine hooks. It's a compelling narrative, I'll grant you that, but it's not actionable intelligence." "But it is," Elias countered, stepping closer to the desk. "The prophecy details the exact psychological state of the target. It says the attack will come when Israel is a land of unwalled villages, living in safety. That's always been the paradox. Modern Israel is a fortress, walls, checkpoints. The Iron Dome meets the antithesis of unwalled. But what if the prophecy isn't about physical walls? What if it's about a state of mind? A reliance on their own military and technological prowess, a belief that their defenses are impenetrable. They feel safe, protected by their own strength, not by God. That is the ultimate vulnerability. They won't see this coming, not in the way it's being planned." He then brought up the core of his discovery. "And the hook, Director. The hook is the key. Ezekiel says God himself puts the hook in their jaw. This isn't a war that Iran or Russia initiates on their own terms. They are being drawn into it. They believe it is their own grand strategy, their moment to reshape the world order. But the text says they are being supernaturally compelled, lured into a trap. We are not just witnessing a geopolitical realignment, we are watching God set a stage to reveal his power to the entire world. They will attack, not because they are strong, but because a higher power is forcing their hand, leading them to a judgment they cannot comprehend." To illustrate his point, Elias brought up a second file. It was from the archives, a file on his old mentor, Dr. Aris Thorne. Thorne was a brilliant historian and theologian who had been a consultant for Aegis years ago, but he was quietly dismissed, his career ruined, for pushing these same theories. He was deemed a religious fanatic, his work a professional embarrassment. Dr. Thorne tried to warn them 20 years ago, Elias said softly. He said to watch the alliance between Persia and the powers of the far north. He said the catalyst would be economic. They called him a lunatic. Now everything he predicted is happening. Kaelin's face softened for a moment, a flicker of regret in his eyes. He remembered Thorne, a good man but out of place. Elias, I respect your conviction, and I respect Thorne's memory. But my job is to deal with the world as it is, not as a prophet described it. Covert operations, cyber warfare, diplomacy, those are my tools. I cannot go to the president and tell him that God is baiting Russia into a war. I would be the next Aris Thorne. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened complex. The intelligence is good. The code name is a significant find. We will increase surveillance. We will warn our Israeli counterparts about a potential coordinated strike. We will act on the what, Elias, but we cannot act on the why. Not your why. He turned back, his expression now firm, a wall of authority. You are to hand over all your files on Operation Hook in the Jaw to the conventional threat assessment team. Your work on this specific angle is over. You're too close to it. Your judgment is compromised by this. He gestured vaguely, as if the very idea of prophecy was a contagion in his sterile world. Elias felt the floor drop out from under him. He had brought them the key to understanding the entire conflict, and they were only interested in the keyhole. They would see the pieces, the troop movements, the economic pressures, the threats, but they would never see the hand arranging them. He was being sidelined, his insight dismissed as obsession. He nodded slowly, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. As he walked out of the director's office and back to his own terminal, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The systems designed to protect the world were blind. They were preparing for a conventional war when what was coming was a divine judgment. The world was sleepwalking toward the edge of a cliff, and he had just been ordered to stop screaming. The silence from Aegis Command was more deafening than any alarm. Stripped of his clearance on Operation Hook in the Jaw, Elias Vance was relegated to analyzing mundane satellite data, tracking shipping lanes and monitoring crop yields. It was a digital prison, designed to keep him busy while the real work, the conventional work, was handled by others. He watched from the sidelines as Kaelin's teams acted on his intelligence, but through their own narrow lens. Bulletins were issued. Diplomatic channels buzzed with cautious warnings. Israel's Mossad received a sterile, anonymous tip about a high-probability threat from a northern coalition, scrubbed clean of any prophetic context. It was like describing a hurricane by only mentioning the wind speed, ignoring the colossal swirling eye of the storm itself. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the gears of the prophecy continued to grind, indifferent to the disbelief of men in windowless rooms. In the Golan Heights, a rugged and windswept plateau that had been a flashpoint for decades, an Israeli Defense Forces, IDF captain named David Alon, stood on a rocky outcrop, binoculars pressed to his eyes. David was a Sabra, born and raised on a kibbutz, just miles from the Syrian border. He knew this land not as a map, but as a living entity, every wadi, every ridge, every ghost of a goat path. For months, he and his reconnaissance unit had been witnessing a change. The enemy was no longer a disorganized collection of militias. There was a new discipline, a new coordination. Through his powerful lenses, he could see them. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC officers, their presence no longer a secret, directing Syrian soldiers and Hezbollah fighters. But it was the other flag he saw, the Russian tricolor, flying brazenly over a newly established observation post that bristled with advanced electronic warfare antennas that made the air feel thin and cold. They weren't just observing, they were integrating. David watched as a Russian drone, a sophisticated all-antenn, performed a lazy figure-8 pattern, its optics undoubtedly mapping his own position. It was a silent, arrogant dance of dominance. One evening, crouched in a forward listening post, David's radio operator, a young tech-savvy soldier named Ben, intercepted a burst of encrypted communication. The encryption was a level they had never encountered before, hybrid of Russian and Iranian cryptographic keys. "Sir, I can't break it," Ben whispered, his face pale in the green glow of his equipment. "But the signal strength, it's a direct link between the IRGC command here and a naval asset in the port of Tartus. They're talking to the Russians in real time, coordinating." David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was the final piece of the tactical puzzle. For years, the threat had been one of proxies and plausible deniability. Now, the puppet masters were on the stage, speaking the same language, sharing the same signal. He reported his findings up the chain of command. The response was clinical, acknowledged. Maintenant surveillance. But David knew, with the instinct of a soldier who has stared death in the face, that surveillance was no longer enough. The enemy wasn't just at the gate. They were measuring it for a battering ram. He thought of his wife Sarah and their 2 young children in Tel Aviv. They lived in a city that pulsed with life and innovation, a bubble of peace and prosperity. They felt safe, protected by the legend of the IDF and the marvel of the Iron Dome. They were the very picture of that land of unwalled villages and deceptive safety that the ancient prophets had warned of. The tension finally snapped on a moonless night. A volley of rockets, far more advanced and precise than anything Hezbollah had launched before, screamed out of southern Lebanon. But they weren't aimed at military targets. They were aimed at the heart of Israel's economic pride, the Karish gas rig, a gleaming steel island in the Mediterranean. The Iron Dome roared to life, a shield of fire and thunder in the night sky, intercepting most of the incoming threats. But 2 got through. Explosions ripped across the platform, sending plumes of black smoke billowing into the heavens. It wasn't a crippling blow, but it was a declaration. The spoil was being targeted. The plunder was being claimed. The attack triggered a furious response. Israeli jets streaked across the sky, their afterburners tearing through the silence. But this time, the rules of the game had changed. As they approached their targets in Syria, the pilots' cockpits lit up with warnings. Their targeting systems were being jammed, their communications drowned in a sea of static. The Russian electronic warfare systems had come alive, providing a protective umbrella for their allies. An Israeli F-16, disoriented by the jamming, was struck by a new generation of Iranian-made surface-to-air missile. A parachute bloomed against the dark sky as the pilot ejected over hostile territory. The hook had been set. The initial strike was the bait. The Israeli response, righteous and necessary, was the pull. The conflict was now irreversible. In Moscow, the president declared Israel the aggressor, citing their unprovoked violation of Syrian sovereignty. In Tehran, crowds chanted for the final destruction of the Zionist entity. In Ankara, the Turkish government condemned Israel's disproportionate retaliation and announced joint naval exercises with the Russian fleet in the eastern Mediterranean. The coalition, once a shadow in an intelligence file, was now a public unified front. The world watched, holding its breath, as the armies began to move. The great northern horde, with Persia at its core, was being drawn south, exactly as the prophecy had foretold. They were coming for a war they believed they would win, oblivious to the fact that their every step was guided by an invisible hand, leading them toward the mountains of Israel for a final divine reckoning. The world held its breath, but the machine of war, once started, has a terrible momentum. The downing of the Israeli pilot and the targeting of the gas rig had shattered the fragile illusion of regional stability. Global news networks broadcast split screens of chaos. The smoldering wreckage in the Golan, furious diplomats shouting at the UN Security Council, and vast columns of military hardware moving under the banners of Russia, Iran, and Turkey. The invasion was no longer a covert plan, it was a televised reality. A multi-front assault began, a pincer movement designed to crush Israel from the north and east. The scope was breathtaking. It was the war David Allon had feared, the war Director Kalin had tried to prevent with conventional means, and the war Elias Vance knew was inevitable. From his sterile exile within Aegis Command, Elias could only watch. The conventional threat assessment teams were in a state of controlled panic, their algorithms and strategic models failing to predict the sheer speed and coordination of the assault. They were fighting the last war. The enemy was fighting a new one, but Elias saw it differently. He wasn't watching a military campaign, he was watching Ezekiel 38 and 39 unfold in real time. He saw the great horde sweeping down from the north. He saw Persia marching alongside them, and he saw Israel, for the first time in generations, truly alone and pushed to the brink of annihilation. The vaunted IDF was fighting bravely, but it was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, its technological edge blunted by the combined might of its adversaries. On the outskirts of Jerusalem, David Alon's unit had been forced into a desperate fighting retreat. The sky, once their protector, was now a source of terror, filled with enemy drones and the constant threat of precision strikes. The ground shook with the ceaseless thunder of artillery. Ben, the young radio operator, lay wounded, his equipment shattered. They were cut off, their ammunition low, their hope fading with the setting sun. Looking toward the holy city, David could see the ominous glow of fires. He clutched the small star of David he wore around his neck, a prayer forming on his lips not for victory, but for a miracle. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he whispered into the dust and smoke, do not forsake us now. It was at that moment, as the invading armies prepared for their final push into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, that the nature of the war changed. It began not with a counterattack, but with a tremor, a low, deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. It was not a localized earthquake. Seismographs across the planet went wild as a great shuddering convulsion shook the entire region. The Bible had promised it. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel. On the battlefields, the ground heaved and split. Tanks and armored personnel carriers were tossed about like toys, many tumbling into newly opened chasms. Fortified command posts collapsed, burying their occupants. But the shaking was just the beginning. The sky, which had been clear moments before, turned a terrifying, bruised purple. A storm of biblical proportions erupted directly over the invading armies, a storm that defied all meteorological explanation. Rain began to fall, a torrential, flooding downpour. Then the rain turned to ice. Hailstones, described in the ancient text as being of great weight, began to fall, each one the size of a fist. They smashed through the canopies of jets, shattered the optics on tanks, and rained down upon the exposed infantry with lethal force. Panic erupted among the coalition forces. Their meticulously planned invasion had dissolved into primal chaos. But God's intervention was not finished. As the hailstones fell, fire began to rain from the sky, not from Israeli jets, which were grounded, but a sulphurous burning rain that ignited fuel depots, ammunition dumps and vehicles, turning the battlefield into a raging inferno. And then came the final, most terrible plague, confusion. In the heart of the chaos, gripped by a supernatural terror they could not comprehend, the soldiers turned on one another. Ezekiel's prophecy was made manifest. I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains. Every man's sword will be against his brother. Alliances forged in political ambition dissolved in a bloodbath of paranoia and fear. Russian units fired on Iranian positions, believing they were being betrayed. Turkish soldiers caught in the crossfire battled both. The mighty coalition devoured itself from within. Back at Aegis Command, the screens went blank. One by one, satellite feeds cut out, communications links died, and the digital eyes and ears of the world's most advanced intelligence agency went blind. Director Kalin stood frozen, staring at a global map where the icons representing the invading armies were blinking out, not in retreat, but in total annihilation. There was no military explanation. No weapon known to man could do this. In the terrifying silence, he looked over at Elias Vance, who was standing quietly by the main monitor, his face filled not with triumph, but with profound, sorrowful awe. What is this, Vance? Kalen's voice was a hoarse whisper. Elias turned, his own eyes reflecting the strange, otherworldly light that now seemed to filter into the room. It's the why, Director, he said, his voice steady. It's Ezekiel 38, verse 23. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. The world was changed forever. The event was not seen as a secret military victory for Israel, but as an undeniable, global, and supernatural event. The nations that had gathered to destroy Israel were themselves destroyed, not by a human hand, but by the very power they had dismissed as myth. Israel, humbled and saved, looked not to its own strength, but to the God who had intervened. And in the quiet aftermath, as a shaken world grappled with the reality of a God who actively shapes history, the true purpose of the prophecy was fulfilled. It was never just about the fate of Iran or the survival of Israel. It was a message to all of humanity that beyond the politics, beyond the armies, and beyond the ambitions of men, there is a sovereign hand guiding the story. A hand that had set a hook, drawn the nations to judgment, and in a single, terrifying display of power, had written the final word.